For those who don't know, the Youth Board of Directors is an organization whose goal is to increase youth participation in conservation governance, along with provide real-world professional development, which this series is clearly a part of. The reason we came up with the workshop series and under the name The Emerging Leaders is to provide some of the professional development needs of aspiring conservation professionals that either aren't traditionally offered in traditional education or aren't provided as trainings for seasonal employees. And so we have decided to start offering this workshop series every other month. And it's starting today with, again, the Secrets to Great Grant Writing workshop. We have 3 panelists today who are willingly offer their expertise in grant writing. And it's going to be moderated by Kelly Seriallo. She's going to go over the timeline for today. We're going to have about 15 minutes for each of our speakers, followed by a question and answer period at the end. I would ask that in response for time and for ease, that if anyone has questions, just drop them in the chat and I'll take a look at them. I'll be moderating that chat during the whole series, and I will ask them at the end. And if anyone has any questions or technical difficulties, just let me know again in the chat and I'll do my best to take care of that. So from here, I'm going to pass this off to Kelly Seriallo and we will get started.
All right, so thanks so much, Sam, and thank you so much for the panelists and everyone that's on the call today. We're excited to get this kicked off, and I think this was a perfect topic. When we initially started talking about professional development opportunities, the idea of grant writing came up several times in our meetings for youth as an important skill as they're developing their career. So I think this was a timely topic, and I think the experts that we picked out today are going to do a great job of introducing it to the youth team. So this is what we have today for the lineup. Dr. Rebecca Pollock is going to kick it off with the intro to great grant writing and tips for success based on her experience. After Rebecca's finished, Dr. Eric Holmlund is going to talk about different types of grants and where to actually find them. He'll also talk about his extensive experience also working with the grant writing process and what that looks like. And then lastly, Colleen Hickey is going to give us some tips behind the actual grant reviewal process. So not only once you've submitted the grant, but what it looks like on the back end and how they approach it, specifically from the Lake Champlain Basin Program's approach. So as Sam mentioned, we'll close out with the Q&A and then some closing thoughts potentially from the panelists and you, and then introductions to our second workshop. So with that, I'm just going to highlight some of the details about the panelists today. So Dr. Becky Pollock is the Executive Director of the Georgian Bay Mnidoo Gamii Biosphere Reserve in Canada. So in the email invitation, there was an extensive bio for Becky on there. So please refer to that bio for further details. For Dr. Eric Holmlund, Dr. Eric Holmlund today is the Director of the Graduate Studies at Paul Smith College. He's also a steering committee member of the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network. And then our final presenter is going to be Colleen Hickey. She's the Education Outreach Coordinator at the Lake Champlain Basin Program and is involved extensively with their grant review process. So each of the speakers today are going to give you further background details about their specific areas of expertise with grant writing. And again, some tips for you of how to apply this to your future career. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Becky. Becky, if I'll stop sharing my screen so you can share yours, and I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Kelly. And hi, everyone. I'll just do a screen share and see if this is ready to go. All right. Can you see my screen, Kelly? Yeah? All right, let's push that button. And we're rolling, although some of my slides are covered by our beautiful faces. Great. Well, hi, everyone. I am Becky Pollock from the Georgian Bay Mnidoo Gamii Biosphere, which is an archipelago in eastern Georgian Bay off Lake Huron in Ontario, Canada. And we're situated in Anishinaabe territory, surrounded by many First Nation communities. And I've been with this organization since about 2002 when I started as a volunteer. Then I joined the board. And finally, when we got some grants, I became staff. So I've got about 20 slides tonight. I'll try to give you some in-depth insight. So first of all, I love writing grants. Through our organization, we process about $1.5 million in grants. We have a pretty good success rate or batting average, 75%. And of the 400 grants that I scan across our work, I write about 40 per year, either helping folks in our office. Some of our youth interns do that work, some of our senior staff, and they're any size of grant. And I've learned that you really have to ask for the funds you need, because it's tempting to say, oh, they've got $1 million to give out, but you need to think through your project first and get help from someone if you're starting out. So tonight, I'm one of the people that you can get some help from. So first, why do you need a grant? Why do you even need a grant? What project do we want to do? You could ask yourself. Okay, a garden maybe. Well, that's great for you, but you need to see it also from your funders. So what impact do your funders want? In other words, what benefits are going to come out of your project? There's a lot of kinds of garden or restoration projects. They can be habitat. Some of my favorite are butterfly gardens. We also do a lot of food gardens and teaching gardens. So it's really important to think, okay, my project, I want to do it, and why do I want to do it at the same time? If you have a project in mind that you're thinking about, use the chat box and throw it in there. I know our moderator's going to check out some of the projects you have in mind that might need a grant. And while we're here, I'll mention that my grant writing history started at age 12 when I wrote my first grant for my school, and it was for a butterfly garden. So I'm basically doing the same thing, 30 years later. And then I joined a grant review committee as a teenager, but it helped me really learn the process. And I wrote grants, bursaries, and scholarships to actually put myself through college. So kind of a life skill. So I know we have a speaker on where to find grants, but in a nutshell, my experience is you can find them everywhere. Money doesn't grow on trees, but as soon as you start looking for opportunities, you'll be amazed at how many there are out there, including every level of government. I've even tapped into some international sources. There's one due this weekend that's for North America, which is very cool. There will be grant databases, of course, and we can all go to Google. But here's my first red flag. Don't just Google it. We need to do smart searches. So be really specific. You're going to group your terms into quotations, actually use quotation marks, and then add a place and a year to narrow down your search. So remember, we were going to do a school garden. So we Google school garden and we get 2 billion results. Not very helpful. If I group my terms into school gardens as one expression, plus grants, plus Kentucky, plus 2022, I get some very focused results that I can just see right away what's still open, because a Google search that shows you a program that was open 5 years ago isn't going to be any good. So I really want to apply this to your whole life. Do smart searches. When you find a grant, you have to ask the question, is this grant really for you? Because it's sometimes hard to tell. You got to really read the detail. First, you're going to check your eligibility as an applicant. Okay, so let's say that you're a school applying, or you're a youth group applying, or you're a not-for-profit or charity even. You will find in the information all of the eligible applicants, as well as who's not eligible. So that's equally important. If you're not eligible, you may have a project partner that is. And I'm not suggesting that they write the grant for you, get the money and funnel it to you. That is not recommended, sometimes not even legal. What we want to do is find project partners that will help you deliver the project. Okay, maybe your school will help with the project, your town. Maybe there's another group that you know of. I want you to know also another red flag is that some grants actually prevent religious activity or political lobbying or fundraising activities. And so you do need to read those details carefully. Great. What else would we do if we did this step by step? Check if we're eligible to apply. Got it. Is your type of project even eligible? Will they fund a school garden? Let's check into that. Then how much funding is available? When is it due? I have lost opportunities over deadlines that have passed. And realistically, can you write a solid, convincing quality application by the deadline? Because if you're rushing it, certainly you'll make mistakes which may disqualify you. So we recommend in our office, we give ourselves at least a 3-month window. And that is because we do get letters of support from our partners. We run around and we meet with people who are doing the project with us. It does take longer. You might be able to do something in a shorter window. But when is it due? Then find out, when do the funds have to be spent by? Because let's say we find a grant and it has to be spent by December 31st this year. That's no good for a school garden. Planting season will be over. 6, check if there are matching funds required. Now, some of you may know all about grants, so this will just be review. But for those who are new to funding, sometimes a funder won't give you 100%. They'll give some matching funds, which might be 50% or 90%. The best ones, of course, give 100. Then speak with your project partners and get their support early. We've been in a situation, unfortunately, where we have added a partner we thought would be interested in a project, and it didn't go well for us. They wanted to be part of the project development. So that's really a good tip too. Then 8, draft your proposal, answer all the questions clearly and fully, develop that detailed budget that we'll talk about, and then prepare any attachments or documents that are required. You're going to have to review it. I beg you, get someone else to read it, then it'll be reviewed and then submit. Okay, so that's like top 10 steps. Let's break this down just a little bit more. Partnerships are groups that will help with your project, as I mentioned, and they can be the lead applicant if they themselves are eligible and you aren't, but it has to be a true partnership. They can also write you a letter of support. Sometimes that's even required. They can donate their time, materials, or money to your project. And remember that some projects will require partners. And in some cases, they will require a partnership agreement, or like one of them did. And we didn't have any agreement that said, hey, you guys have to do this. And so we didn't have any protection. It was really a bad situation. So think hard about trusted partners. Let's use a fake example. So the American Earthworm Society, there is one in Britain. I don't think there's one in America. Let's see this grant, American Earthworm Society funding. First, are we eligible applicants? Well, we want to do a school garden and they fund schools. 2, eligible activities include gardens. Good. 3, how much funding are they offering? Okay, up to $200,000. That's pretty good for a small school garden. We might not need that much. 4, when is it due? It sounds like January 30th, 2022 at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and that matters. So if you and your group think that that's enough time to apply by the end of January, then this is a really great opportunity for you. But when does the money need to be spent by? Because like I said, if this is one of those grants that's a 3-month and you've got to be done in the end of March next year, I don't think your garden's going in the ground. So really be careful about spending dates and deadlines. What percentage of the project will they fund? It says grants will pay up to 90%. Score, this is great. I think we can come up with 10%. 7, what do they fund? Materials, salary, and stipends. So that's great. And the benefits that they're looking for, they need dietary benefits and mental health benefits. So if you think that your garden outcomes and impacts will have those things, then you're good to go. And they even provide a template for the budget. So that's great. A lot of applications now will be online portals, or you'll create an account, or you'll download the form, fill it in, and then upload it. So it's nice to have those templates. So I think the fake example worked out for us. Way to go, American Earthworm Society. Now, budgeting terms, you may be familiar with all of this, and I do apologize, but just as an overview for budgets in grants, you really are going to be asked to show all your income sources and then all your detailed expenses. Income is all the money coming in. Expenses, all the money is going out, you're spending it. The net or balance is that calculation of income minus expenses. And just quickly, you know, if you have $1,500 left over of balance that's unspent or surplus, that's not great. I mean, funders don't want to see that. Sometimes you'll have to return it. Another scenario is that you balance your budget. You spend that 2,500 out of 25 and you get a balanced budget. That's your goal, right? Or in climate terms, net zero. And then the third example is a red flag. You do not want to overspend your dollars. You do not spend more than you have. Okay, that's a deficit. Very bad news bears. You may have to pay that, suck that up. The grant won't pay you for that necessarily. Almost certainly they won't. So be aware of your numbers. There's another two terms I want to use tonight. One is in kind. What's in kind, everybody? It's non-cash support that has a cash value. And matching support we talked about is that percentage that the grant will pay out. So that's often 50% in my world. Sometimes it's up to 90. And sometimes if it's 100% the grant will pay, then you don't need any matching. Although I'm sure our experts coming up will tell me it's always good to show some financial support. So quickly, we want to calculate our income for this grant. The grant pays up to 90% of that $200,000 for our garden. So that would be, we could ask for up to 180,000 from them. But wait a minute, if your project will only cost 25,000, we think, then we need 90% of that, because we're going to bring 2,500 to the table, leaving 22,500 of our funding request. And then this grant allows for cash and in-kind matching, which is great news. So watch what we do next. We're going to calculate our expenses. We need to check what's eligible and what's not. There are grants that I worked with this fall that will pay only materials, no travel, no salary, no administration. So that means you're buying the plants and the soil for your garden. But if they pay salary or wages, volunteer stipends or honorarias, maybe contractors, professional services, it might be called, or builders and designers. We have a graphic designer, a young graphic designer we use all the time to design signs and logos. So we pay him out of these grants. We'll also need the materials and supplies, lumber, our soil, our fence, our seedlings. And then we'll need what might be called capital expenses. Or permanent structures. And this is another red flag, because sometimes you'd think that a fence is materials like lumber, but other grants will actually consider that a permanent installation like a capital expense, and it may not be allowed. So check. And then administration. My dream is that every grant will allow us 15% of the budget for filing costs and my bookkeeper, paying insurance here, keeping the lights on. And that's sometimes allowed, but double check. So now how do we do that income matching or leverage? The best easy matching is pure cash. Like if our school gave us $1,000, but we have no cash. Too bad. The harder matching is the in-kind calculations, but you can do that. What we're trying to do is find out our sources of donations, like the garden nursery will give you 10% off plants. Great. Local contractor will donate $500 in lumber. Great. And volunteers have agreed to donate 100 hours of time in total. So now we ask, what is the in-kind worth to your budget?
Becky, just so you know, you got a 2-minute warning.
That's great. So the garden nursery, we've got $100 from them in value, 500 in lumber from them, and volunteers are worth 1,500. So that's really great news. We bring all that into our budget, and we still need to raise $400. So you're going to need to get creative about that. And in my world, that could be a bake sale, local businesses, find another grant. But the easiest way is also lower your budget. You don't need the full 22,000. You can shrink that and adjust your matching down. Okay. So at the end of the day, you're going to list all of your expenses there on the left, expenses in the first column, describe them a little bit, show what the funder is paying, show what you, the applicant, is paying, and then those totals. And you'll notice that we double check, are our expenses eligible in here? Because if you put in something that's not, you could be disqualified right away. Does your balance actually budget? Check the rows totals and the columns. Good. But if you're looking carefully at this, you'll notice that the very last line of materials was left blank with no description. So you'll see that that's an error, and the funders are going to say, I don't know what you're asking 1,500 there for. So I just wanted to show you the detail that's required. Administration, we can talk about another day, but it is my secret weapon that makes my organization thrive. We ask for 15% of every project budget, and that will go to rent and utilities, like I said, and that's really important. So I just want to flag that as a real opportunity for you. If administration's covered, ask for it. And required documents, your funder may require proof of your organization's legal coverage or proof of insurance, those letters of support, or a map of the garden, you know, all of those things. So it takes time to gather this for you and upload it. And finally, our next speakers will be talking about what funders are actually looking for. And it is those SMART projects. They have to have impact, be persuasive, be justified, be reasonable. They have to follow all the rules, okay? And once you get the grant, now what? You review your agreement because it's a legal contract. You have to understand it and who can sign for it. And then you put all your reporting dates on your calendar. You set up your financials to get the money, and then you can celebrate and let your partners know. That's the first cupcakes. Then you get a project work plan together. You might need to hire someone or organize the work bees and order supplies. And most of all, you're going to keep all your receipts clearly filed. You're going to celebrate with the media, photos and videos, recognize your partners and volunteers, and of course, you're going to plan for your next grant. So in conclusion, getting grants can change the world. There is a grant out there for you. I know you can convince your funders why it's important. And now with these tips tonight, you will have all the information you need. And I think these slides will be available to you, okay? So if at first you don't succeed, try again and again. So thank you so much. Miigwech.
Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation, Becky, and those examples. I want to highlight a few things that you had said that I think are critically important, right? So things that don't necessarily come to mind, right? So the thing that you mentioned about the matching, right? So I think when you first hear about grants, I remember hearing about that first and I was like, what does that mean? How come they don't just give us the money? And then the importance of reporting, right? So we actually have a youth team member on the call, Georgian, that just was recently funded from a grant and was able to make a documentary from it. And Georgian, during the Q&A, I'll ask him to share his experience with that because it was really interesting through the process of watching him go through that and actually getting the grant. So excellent examples, Becky. And I will share Becky's PowerPoint along with the rest of the PowerPoints from today. So thank you again, Becky. That was fantastic. So Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you. So Eric, our next presenter, again, he is the Director of Graduate Studies at Paul Smith College, and he's going to be sharing with us shortly, highlighting about the different types of grants and where to find them. So Eric, I'll let you share your screen. And if you need help, I can also pull it up. Perfect.
You're seeing the pink screen. All right. Okay, so this is a sort of quick association. What in the world does this slide have to do with grant writing? Any responses?
I just like ice cream. That's it.
No, that's it. Okay. Well, I asked my daughter that question and she said, you're giving him the scoop on grant writing. So I guess that one would work. I also think it's time for you to get your share and it's out there. So dig in and take a scoop. It's there to be sort of tapped and used. So it's an opportunity. All right, so I'm going to take a slightly different approach and do some storytelling. I tried to think about where you are in your careers as US Biosphere early career visionaries, and then take advantage of the thing that I've got, which is essentially some years under my belt, to tell you a story about my own experience. So I'm going to tell you some stories about what I've done, but then the second half is some generalizations that I think will reinforce what we just heard from the previous speaker. So the first caveat is I think you're going to see very quickly that I'm not writing 40 grants a year and I'm not a grant specialist. I'm an academic. I'm not an advancement officer as well. So the first half is going to be storytelling. The second half will be generalization. See if you can see who I am in this picture from 2000 when I started this grant story, and I'm not the one with the hair. So a little bit about who I am. If you notice, that first picture was from 2000. I started with a staff, I think, of 5. Last year, or 2019, 2 years ago, when I retired from being the director of the program, I could only fit it in a huge photograph like this. But I'm mostly an academic. The summer job of the Watershed Steward program that I'm going to tell the story about was just a summer thing for one summer. It turned into summers for 20 consecutive years, and eventually it became 80% of my job. And it was entirely funded by grants and contracts that totaled $18 million in competitive grants over 20 years. And the bulk of that came in the last 7 or 8 years. So the early years were sparse. Our storyline for our invasive species program, I really started with small private grants and then worked into federal grants. And then we really hit the big time with some really large state contracts. And the point of the growth of this program was we had an issue that was brought to us at the college, invasive species, that started as an obscure issue, but became an issue that galvanized an entire community. So it was a perfect issue. I was at the right place to add some value, and actually the issue gained in importance while the funding sources also grew. So it was kind of a perfect story. So the story of aquatic invasive species sold the program. So I guess, you know, the point that you could take, you're not going to be writing grants about aquatic invasive species, but think about the story of your need. And the need of this program that I was part of for 20 years was so easily translated into really strongly visual messages. It was something that people could understand, they could see all around them. It affected every community in a major park. And it also connected our park with other points of origin of visitors all across the country and really across the world. And it was also something that we could do something concrete and tangible about. You know, we had enough people checking enough boats, we could protect the waters of the Adirondacks. What an incredible story. This next slide is very complex, so I'm going to kind of take my time with this. And it tells the story of the growth of this program. And obviously, this is a particular story. It's my story. But I want you to think about what points from this story resonate with you and perhaps could be applicable to other contexts. So in the upper right, we talk in invasive species about getting ahead of the curve, you know, trying to attack this issue of invasive species while there are very few of them on the landscape. And as you move up the curve, they're harder and harder and more expensive to take to address because they're all over the place. So likewise, I made a graphic about the awareness curve, essentially in the lower left, where very few people in 2000 really knew that invasive species were an issue. And their awareness was growing just as the threat of invasive species was growing. And luckily enough, funding sources lagged behind, but they also grew, including the Lake Champlain Basin Program. So in this first era, our program only had 8 or 10 or 12 employees for the first 10 or 12 years. It was just a very few people at a very few lakes. And I call this the core partner era, where we were expanding outward from a single lake association to regional invasive species management partnerships, including the Lake Champlain Basin Program and the Lake Georgian Association. So we started making more and more friends. It just spread beyond one lake, eventually to other lakes that were very well known, like Lake Placid and Saranac Lake, and then partnerships with Lake George, which is the queen of Adirondack lakes. So we were growing and growing and growing. And then there was this particular point in 2010 when the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative was created. And I essentially took a shot in the dark and applied for a grant, my first major grant, and I believe it or not, I got it. And that led to kind of great things, you know, sort of a great expansion of the program. We could have many, many more employees, and suddenly we were on the map. So honestly, before this time, New York State was kind of not paying a lot of attention to us because it was a little bit controversial that we would have uniformed employees at all these boat launches. So we had to prove ourselves to New York State. So the feds came on in our second era. So federal dollars from the Basin Program, from Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, from US Fish and Wildlife Service. This really legitimized our program in the eyes, honestly, of New York State. So finally, New York State started to fund us, but only after I engaged local political partners. I made alliances with county supervisors, but also with sportsmen's groups, fishermen, people that would typically be a little perhaps skeptical of an environmental program, but they all cared about it as well because it affected them with something they love, you know, fishing and access to sort of unimpeded waterways. So once we got the political powers that be inside the Adirondack Park on our side, then New York State had permission to give us a lot of money. So really this political sort of phase of our development helped us grow so much more. Without that, New York State would have had the cover to give us this money. So toward the end of my career, I want to point out how, you know, our key tipping point was the local government buy-in, but we started getting into private partnerships with private business just toward the very end of my time in the Steward program. And I think that could have been a tremendous step forward, and they're still working on it. But I guess the point is, we started with a $50,000 a year budget in 2000, and we were up about 50 times that, or 48 times that, by the end of my term. And it was all because of these large state and federal grants, because of aquatic invasive species resonating with people. So this graphic points out the cycle of funding. So initially, we were just applying for grants every single year, incredibly labor intensive. Sort of in the middle of our growth, we got into these 3-year cycle grants, federal grants, Fish and Wildlife Service, EPA. And then ultimately, New York State gave us a 10-year contract. So our dream was getting beyond the annual grant cycle into some multi-year kinds of grant opportunities. And eventually we got there. So some lessons of my story here. First, nonlinear growth. We had a long period, so the front end of the curve, we're just making it from year to year to year. And then we had a big breakthrough moment, and then we had declines. So essentially we had ups and downs, and these descents were challenging for us, but didn't keep us back ultimately, and we were able to keep going. So the other lesson is to anticipate a common, visible programmatic need. Pollinator gardens, earthworms, and food. These are great issues that resonate, and really everyone can understand them. For us, aquatic invasive species worked very well. It was something people could really understand and identify with. To leverage local interest and involvement. Go beyond your college, your school, your club. The last presentation talked about making these partnerships to bake sales and work bees and all these things. So yes, absolutely, the local interest and involvement. You're not sort of isolated. You're part of a larger community. Build and maintain partnerships. The upper right shows the steering sort of apparatus that we constructed around the invasive species program. And it was all the players. It was the environmental organizations, but it was also sporting clubs, sporting organizations, local towns, local municipal governments, and then of course state agencies. So ultimately, the marine trade was part of our steering committee as well. So getting these people involved, holding legitimate meetings where you actually listened to them and you sought out their perspectives. So the state in this case was a little skeptical of us. We had to kind of prove it, and then they funded us. So it was a little bit backdoor. Patience, persistence, and positioning. And the key moment for me was not being afraid to go for a big federal grant. In fact, I was advised against going for a big federal grant by the Nature Conservancy. They said, "Don't waste your time." I said, "I'm going to waste my time," and I got it. The other point I want to make is these two people, Jane and Ed. I became really close friends with these property owners who were who founded the Adirondack Lakes Alliance. And they were at every one of my key meetings, and I listened to them, and they helped shape my program. And it wasn't my program, it was the college's program. So being willing to let folks in the larger community actually have input and shape your mission in your program. Okay, so the next step here is I'm done with my narrative. Now I'm going to start giving you some of the points that I picked up in preparation for this presentation. And that is the first thing for a lot of folks, a lot of the undergraduates that I talk to, they talk about grants as if there's some kind of magic treasure box, and that money is going to come directly to an individual. And that's obviously a misunderstanding. Grants don't fund individuals; they fund an idea that meets a current need. So if you're part of that idea and part of that need, great. But they're not necessarily going to fund you, as far as I know. They fund a program sponsored and housed by an organization that you're aligned with. So back to this idea of partnerships with existing organizations, and they're already there, and you're going to help connect them to a greater source of funding that you can benefit from as well. You're the catalyst, but not the object, generally speaking. And I could be wrong with some of this, so I'm sure you'll correct me. So keys to success, innovation and creativity. And then this other one that came from the source that I consulted in preparation here is calling the program officer. Luckily, our third presenter is a program officer, and you need to develop that relationship with the program officer. They want you to succeed, and they will do great things to help you clarify your proposal and also get through and get over whatever challenges that you're facing, because it's their job to get the money out there. So a grant versus a contract, a little technical. Most of us are looking at grants rather than contracts, and I think it's a useful definition. A grant is a project conceived by an investigator. I guess that would be you or your partner. The agency that's granting the money supports or assists. They don't do the work. You define the details and you retain some freedom, but the agency is maintaining oversight. So essentially, they want to do the work that you're doing, but they allow you some space to do it. Of course, they're going to hold you accountable to some general standards, but you do have some freedom to move, more or less. Okay, grant categories, government, public tax dollar grants, the federal government, you can go to grants.gov. It's a tremendous source. You can search this database. And the information that I got indicates that federal grants are sometimes driven by changes in political agenda. For instance, Obama started the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and it survived the Trump administration. But different administrations have different priorities, so grants might come and go with the political agenda. And state money is sometimes work that is outsourced when state budgets constrict and they can no longer do the same work with their existing staff. So rather than hiring new staff, they outsource it to us, to the public to do this work. That's essentially what our Watershed Steward program is doing. So you can think of yourself as doing outsourced work for applied projects. So they have, both the federal and state have these elaborate grant portals. The Basin Program has a wonderful, you're going to see it, sort of a portal for its grants. So I'd say, these portals are important for you to become comfortable with. But how do you access the portals? I'll get to that in a later slide. The other categories.
You just got a 2-minute warning.
Okay, the foundations, private money, and corporations. So the private foundations are typically a simpler process, and they have a geographic focus, whereas corporations sometimes really have grant programs that are for their own corporate image. So at Paul Smith College, we're part of this paid foundation directory that alums, I think with faculty help, can have access to. All of your institutions of higher education are going to have similar kinds of databases that you could plug into. Federal grants, you have to be one of these entities. I'm going to move through this, but I want to spend some time on this slide. So the grant officers are really the folks that you need to partner with at whatever institution you're with. At colleges and higher education, it's typically offices of sponsored research. So there's usually one person at a university or another agency that can submit a grant. They're the designated sort of point of contact. So you will have to work through typically one person who's this designated point of contact. Okay. And then I also wanted to point out a couple of these tips here about starting with small grants that are easier wins. And also I wanted to point out Ithaca College has a tremendously, kind of a really rich and grant sort of training portal here that I suggest that you spend some time with. So for a recap, I think you probably already have a tremendous number of ideas. You've got the seeds for fundable visions. It's likely that you will win a grant if you just get started and do it, but prepare for some rejection at the beginning. Keys are building partnerships, meeting a current need, and contacting those grant officers. Okay, so I think I've run out of time, but hopefully that's given you a few things to think about in addition to my long story of my own process. So happy to answer questions, and I'll end.
That was excellent, Eric. So, and I think the story, I think I speak on behalf of everyone else, the story helped really kind of frame, the process and how a grant program can truly develop and flourish in the way that you described. And I really like what you said too. It built on Becky's earlier points about the importance of partnerships, right? So I just want to highlight that. So when you're thinking about first grant writing, and Eric emphasized this too, think about it, it's not for you per se, right? So it's not, you're not writing it for you, but it's on behalf of your organization. And I think that's what's really interesting about Biosphere specifically, is that they're often a network of networks. So when you're thinking about writing this grant, don't just think about your Biosphere specifically, but what other organizations and partnerships can you form to help support this need that you're thinking about? Becky gave that great example of the garden, right? So that's a perfect, tangible a grant application that has a very specific timeline because of the growing season. So in your case, think about, is there a project that would have a series of partners like Eric and Becky both described that you can collaborate with and help develop this, the grant application. Another thing I want to point out that Eric brought up and Becky touched on as well. So what's very interesting about this skill set that goes along with grant writing is that it's funny when you think of writing, it's such a form of technical writing, but there's also creativity to it as well. So the idea when I say technical, you follow the directions exactly like they're written, right? So like it's not, you can't veer off track and be like, I can make this work. So Becky had said the turnaround time they normally have is like 3 months in terms of preparation. There's a reason for that. It's because it takes a really long time to make sure that you're covering all of those bases. So, and Eric, I've seen him write grants, and it's very interesting because he pulls the language that they're asking for. He's very meticulous about pulling the exact language that they're looking for and feeding it right back to them. And so I think that's a really interesting strategy when you're thinking about forming the application itself, allowing for creativity and kind of coming up with innovative solutions to address the problem that you're addressing with your project, but at the same time, making sure that you're exactly hitting on what they're asking for. Because sometimes, and I think Colleen's going to hit on this, sometimes it's close, but there's other applications that fit, the call for, the request, for applications much better. So I think you touched on very good points. And the other thing I just want to emphasize that both of them touched on, this idea of timeline. So the reporting process with grants can be complicated, right? When you're required to spend the money itself. So it's something that when you're working on developing something like this, it's often helpful to have a team. And I think that Becky had mentioned like putting those dates in your calendar. That's the only way you can manage it, right? So there's so many dates to have to remember. So the time management of grants is a really critical piece. So it's not just getting the money and running with it, but understanding the time required from it. So with that, I do want to turn it over to, so thank you so much, Eric. I think we're going to have some more questions and comments for you at the Q&A. So excellent presentation. So Colleen, I do want to turn it over to you. I will share my screen and you just tell me when you need me to click and we'll go from there. Oh, that's not the one. Okay, so let's see. Here we go. Okay. All right. Too many PowerPoints open. Okay. Colleen, the floor is yours.
Sure. Okay. Thanks very much, Kelly. And it was great to listen to Eric and Becky as well. I'm sort of on the flip side of things where Becky is applying for grants. I'm being the grant manager for 40 or 50 grants up until this year, then I got help. So it's great. So I was asked to do behind the scenes. So here we go. Here's the show. So the Basin Program has been around since 1991, but because I wasn't sure where folks were coming from, the next 2 slides will focus on Lake Champlain because it addresses some of the issues that we face in grant writing. Okay, Kelly. So Lake Champlain is up here in the northern quadrant. New York, Vermont, and Quebec make up our drainage basin. We have about 8,234 square miles within our region. We've got a lake that's about 120 miles long, and it's a bilingual area. And that sometimes can be a little bit tricky in grants as well. Lake Champlain drains north to the Richelieu River and then out to the St. Lawrence. So it's a very large area. It drains about 48.5% of the state of Vermont, but a very small percent of the state of New York, and an even smaller percent of Canada and the province. So how the jurisdictions look at lake issues is very different. Next slide, Kelly. So we're a partnership among New York, Vermont, and Quebec, US EPA, and the federal agencies that provide funding from things like aquatic invasive species to salmon restoration to agricultural production. A lot of big federal players here, and we're really glad that a lot of that money in the last 5 years especially has gone out to local growths, including Paul Smith's. We were created in 1990 by the Lake Champlain Special Designation Act. Many of you might have heard that Senator Leahy is stepping down in 2023. And although we work with both delegations in New York and Vermont, he is certainly the lead Lake Champlain champion. And he's setting up Lake Champlain and our partners very well for the next several years. We are technically a not-for-profit. Our funding comes primarily through the EPA, and our administrator is New EPIC, which is an organization in Lowell, Massachusetts, which handles all of our fiscal aspects. So it's another layer that our grantees need to be familiar with. Kelly? Lake Champlain is a beautiful lake. If you haven't been here, I already have just put going to Becky's location on my bucket list. That was a fantastic photo. Here you're on the southern portion of Lake Champlain on the Vermont shoreline, where it's mainly agricultural land, looking across the Crown Point Bridge to the Adirondacks. So a big watershed with lots of varying landscapes. Next slide, Kelly. Great. So we have had about 1,500 grants and $17 million since 1992. I just showed a couple of quick snapshots from invasive species to the way that we work with the agricultural community to do cover cropping, to planting riparian buffers, to working with students and community groups to look at stream monitoring data and collect macroinvertebrate information, to just students exploring the streams and rivers for the first time. This particular graphic in the middle comes from the Lake Champlain Atlas, which was last updated in about 2018, and hence that's what the data is relevant to. But what it shows is that one of the things that we try to do when we are working with federal dollars is make sure we're covering our entire geographic region. And so when you're looking at your grants, make sure your geography matches to those grant requirements as well. Next slide, Kelly. So who recommends who gets funded? It's very complicated. Right now, we just issued $250,000 for education and outreach grants and organizational support. But meanwhile, our technical committees were reporting out on recommendations for about $1 million today. So there's a lot of money that's flowing. There are a lot of key partners that are making everything happen, boots on the ground in this watershed, along with the states and the feds. So who gets funded is really important. We start with a broad audience of reviewers who are committed not just to the watershed, but to doing homework. Our reviewers have to put in a significant number of hours to make these challenging decisions. And two of the factors that I look at when I am recruiting each year for this group of volunteers are what are the watershed topics in which they're familiar, because we need hard science, we need education, we need invasive species. I scan through the list of incoming grant applications and try to make sure we have the knowledge to match those grant applications, because community members on panels can provide a lot of additional information, again, for what's happening at the local level. We also try to make sure that we cover the broad geographic reach of this watershed, which, as you might imagine, is a challenge. Once this group of reviewers has completed its review, we then boot it up to the Lake Champlain Steering Committee, which makes the final decision on who gets funded. And the majority of the time, it's right in line with the recommendations that are coming from the reviewers. Next slide, please. So how do we decide who gets funded? Well, we can't pick our favorites, and staff would have its favorites, just like you would have your favorites in your own communities. But again, involving federal dollars, we have to be very careful. As a result, Basin Program staff does not actually rank the grants. Our job is to help grant applicants, like Eric said, figure out what we're asking for in those grants. And secondly, to make sure as they are coming into the pile, that those grants meet all the qualifications and that they are complete and that they are ready to advance to the next step for the review team. We adhere to a very strict conflict of interest guidelines, so that if a member of Trout Unlimited is on our committee, he or she can't be in a review pool that has a Trout Unlimited application, or maybe a salmon restoration application, because that too is too close, even though it's not their own organization. We review each grant thoroughly, and I say we, staff reviews them as well. We just don't score them. But the local grant reviewers score the grants by a set of criteria, which should be outlined in whatever grant application you're seeking. We develop a preliminary ranking based on the cumulative score. So if I have 5 reviewers, we're taking a look at the 5 reviews cumulatively. Staff takes a look at the outliers, and the committee talks about those outliers. Did something get funded at the bottom of the pile because somebody misunderstood something that was happening in that grant. Okay, Kelly, next slide. When do we decide who gets funded? Well, first of all, it's like the ants go marching one by one. One by one, those applications are read very thoroughly. So everything you write in the grant application gets read, and it will get read usually by 4 or 5 people if it involves federal funds. But after they develop recommendations, we add comments and concerns to what's called a record of decision, and that will then move to our steering committee. And then we will provide, once those are funded, we will provide feedback to every applicant who seeks to know why they did not get funded, as well as those that did. So they get to see the little summary in their award letter, and then we give them our phone numbers and our website to follow up in person. And it's a pretty good step that's really important to take, I think. If you don't get funded, find out why. It strengthens your application the next time. Next slide, please, Kelly. And why do we do this? Local grant implementation is really critical to improving Lake Champlain's future. I showed you a beautiful slide. This is a slide after Tropical Storm Irene, where water that was running through 2 of the New York rivers met up in the middle of the lake with the Winooski River out of Burlington and was flowing north up to my end of the lake. The sediment load was tremendous. And it's not to say what's wrong in the lake, it's to say how much work is needed in the upper elevations to keep that soil in place, and how many communities and volunteers are needed to make that happen. So local work is critically important on the ground. I think there's just 1 or 2 more slides, Kelly. This happens to be a picture of my coworker's daughter, who can't wait to get to the lake every single spring. She's the last one in the family who wants to have her feet in the lake. We do this for children like Ellie and for that next generation. So it doesn't matter if you're 61 like me or in your 40s, or I had the pleasure of working with Georgian last year on his grant. And it's just tremendous. So many people in so many decades of their life love the lake. They love your geographic regions too, and helping them advance the importance of the natural resources in your hometowns and home areas is critically important. So that's why we fund these. And the last slide should just give you a couple of websites that'll now be on the recording. But we have our grants and requests for proposals posted on our website in advance of the deadlines. So if you are interested in seeing examples of what other groups do, you are welcome to check out ours. You can also check out the State of the Lake report, and all of the grants that we fund have to deal with the status of the management of issues for Lake Champlain. So that's our focus, and the State of the Lake report helps to drive some of those issues. So you're also welcome to send me an email if you're trying to figure out, I don't know, grants in your area, but I'd be happy to help troubleshoot or listen for anyone who's trying to write grants for the first time. So thank you very much.
That was extremely helpful. Thank you so much, Colleen. I think it's a perfect way to round out the presentations for today. So yeah, this was a great panel. And again, Colleen mentioned some key points, in terms of the grant review process. I was actually involved, and I didn't realize how extensive the review process was at the Lake Champlain Basin Program. So I was a part of that, and I'll tell you what I really appreciated how thorough, and they use extensive rubrics. So in terms of what Colleen said, you can't just pick your favorites. The first thing, and they ask you is, do you have a conflict of interest? They show you kind of the list of people that submitted, and it's really extensive. I mean, it was my first time doing it. I'm embarrassed to tell you how long I spent on it, but it was the better half of a day. It was just a lot. It was a lot to read. And so I really appreciated the process. And I think it made me feel better in terms of, how extensive and thorough they look at the details. So it's not just kind of skimming over, does this sound good? They do a deep dive and assess you on multiple levels. So that was really helpful to understand the back end of that. Thank you again, Colleen. So we have a lot of excellent questions in the chat and some comments. Sam, I'll leave it over to you to manage the Q&A, and thank you for your active participation in the chat box here. So Sam, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, like Kelly said, there were some good questions. If the question askers don't mind, I have them all recorded, so I'm going to ask them. If those who have asked the questions would like further clarification, please feel free to just raise your hand in the little text box. I'm going to keep my eye on all the screens as well, and I'll make sure that you get an opportunity to follow up. So few of these were, or none of these were specific to an individual speaker. So any one of the three panelists is welcome to answer at any point. And we'll start off. So one of the first ones was, how do you share the grant writing responsibilities with multiple partners, especially if those partners are employed elsewhere, full-time, or students? And if any of the presenters just want to throw your hand up, and I'll just tell whoever gets there first, I'll call on you.
I'm happy to speak to this,
There you go, Becky.
Sam, but I'm looking to my other colleagues here. So I just want to tell you from my perspective, it's my organization that's the lead applicant. In other words, we do most of the grant writing. And actually, it's really helpful to have a lead writer. Over the years, we developed teams of writers. So this might answer your question. Someone who's just absolutely wizard on Excel and budget creation and numbers. And someone who's a really strong and convincing technical writer that really uses the language of the funders to make sure that that's built in. And then we always use an outside reader, like a third party that doesn't have anything to do with the project, to read it and really say, is this what you mean? Or this didn't seem realistic. How are you going to achieve this? So I would say that the main roles are sort of a lead applicant that really understands the grant, but you can delegate some of those other tasks. The project partners are more on the defining the scope of the project up front, like, oh, we want to do these workshops here and here, and we can give you this in-kind support and so on. So it's more of a conversation or a project planning session, I find, with partners, and then definitely getting a letter of support if it's required. It's not as popular as it was once, but there are still requirements where a letter has to come from the partner saying in writing how much, cash or in kind they can commit and supporting the project. And we always try to provide a template that they can then, because they're busy, right? You've just told me they have a day job. They can take the template, put it on their letterhead, they can change the text that they want and then sign it and send it back. So those are my thoughts.
Fantastic. Becky, thank you so much. Colleen, Eric, do you have anything to add before I move on to the next question?
No, I think that's a good answer.
No, I would just say that if you write it, you in my experience, you kind of own it, and you're responsible for it, and all through the entire phase of the of the grant execution and the report writing. And I mean, there's kind of a lot there. It's a big responsibility. So you can't just write it and walk away.
So this next question is a sort of combination of two, being, how did, before you were able to address or get 3-year cyclical grants, how did you pay for that yearly grant writing cycle? And then simultaneously, what was a realistic timeline for hiring your first full-time employee?
So is that for me?
Eric, yeah,
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, you have to have a job that pays you enough for your basic, functions. And then basically for me, it was summer activity. So I just wrote it. I did all the administration on top of my sort of, regular teaching duties. It was all spec time, essentially, time added. but yet I didn't, I had enough income from my main job to justify it. And that's just part of what you do as an academic. So I think each person's job might be a little different, but it's just rolled in. It's just rolled in. You've got to be able to, spend quality time on it though. It can't be something that's just evenings and weekends.
And then Becky, obviously you were a part of building out Georgia Bay. And so that timeline for hiring that first full-time employee, what did that look like for your organization? And do you think that would be typical in biospheres generally?
Ooh, it's really hard to comment on what's typical in biospheres because we know that they're all very unique in terms of their structure, their capacity, how they're set up. But I would say, honestly, we worked as volunteers for 6 years to get the UNESCO Biosphere designation. Some sites, that creates a lot of burnout of your volunteers. Canada tends to be very grassroots in their nominations for biospheres. Other countries are very top down. It's federal state government that says, this region, you're a biosphere. So I would say that because we had volunteers push it over the top, the founding board made sure that there were some grant writers. And I just put a comment in there that retired grant writers make great volunteers because as it turned out, we needed someone from day one that we were official to write that grant. And it was a small grant. It was a 1 or 2 year project on species at risk that had a project coordinator. It was an community education project on mostly reptiles, snakes and turtles. And actually what happened out of that was it gave us enough of a track record to show funders we could actually apply for larger grants, longer grants. And it wasn't until 4 years into being a biosphere that we got multi-year funding that hired a coordinator to run the organization, what I call a warm body and a phone. Because I really believe you can do anything with a warm body and a phone. Like they can write the grants and they can get the partnerships going. And so, 15 years later, we had 5 permanent staff, 8 summer students. We now have 22 staff.
Wow.
So I would just say that it is incremental. So that example about a school garden, if that was a high school project, my garden might have been $2,500 grant. So again, you can manage that and then build up and build up and build up. And then it'll be a $22 million grant and it'll be your full-time job.
Gotcha.
So,
So
yeah.
that actually leads nicely into this next question. Colleen, I think this might actually be one for you, which is what type of feedback and results reporting are grant supplying institutions looking from their successful grant applicants following the completion of the project?
Yeah, that's a great question that came in, Sam. So for the Basin Program, we have a quarterly report process, and these should all be outlined in that request for proposal or grant application that you're applying for. You should know right up front what those are because they can be time consuming. We try to keep ours pretty simple, but folks have to report out each calendar quarter, and then they have to report out at the end of the grant. We use that data publicly to talk about partnerships and to show boots on the ground. So your final report could be as concise as possible, but get in every little thing that you got accomplished because you don't know how that data can be beneficial when for example, the Basin Program is going to answer to a newspaper on the north end of the lake saying, we don't know where the federal dollars go. And we're like, we know where the federal dollars go. And they're going right back into your community. So everything that you say in a quarterly report or a final report can help build the case for more dollars sometimes coming into your region. So I hope that'll help. And photographs, please, please, please take great high quality resolution photographs that are standalone JPEGs or TIFFs or something else. So instead of embedding them in a document, make sure they're good and that they're selling your program.
Thank you. Well, I want to be cognizant of time. I think we've actually just slightly gone over our hour. Kelly, I want to make sure that there isn't anything else that you'd like to touch on before we finalize our first ever workshop series. But
just a sincere thank you again to the panelists for taking the time out of your evening to join us today, and for the people, the attendees, for for joining us. We hope that you do join for the next one, but I'll turn it back over to Sam to tell you a little bit more about the next one. But thank you so much, Becky, Colleen, and Eric. This was wonderful.
Yeah, so I'd like to thank again the panelists. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, your enthusiasm. I have a strong feeling that the names you saw on the call will be names you will see again, either asking for support or grant writing backup, or hopefully just applying for grants. In terms of the Emerging Leaders Workshop series, there will be another workshop coming up in January that'll follow a similar format. We're still finalizing the topic. We have one panelist lined up, and we'll be sending out calendar invites along with updated posters and whatnot in the coming weeks. And once again, thank you all so much for this first launch of the Emerging Leaders Workshop series, and we look forward to seeing all of you or many of you again next time.
Great.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
And I'll be sure to share all of the PowerPoints with you as well.
Oh yeah, we'll also be making this this presentation shareable for anyone in your network. So thank you again, folks. Take care. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Take
Thank
care.
you.